Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And today we are going to talk about essentially the subject of Parak Bet of Sanhedrin. Subject of Parak Bet of Sanhedrin really is bringing up the question of how Sanhedrin, how the judicial system can not only tame society, but even tame the leadership of society. Can it or can it not? And in that regard, we really do have that very strange notion of a melech is not dan ve'in danin אותו. A melech does not serve as a judge and cannot be judged. And it's a very interesting concept that I think at first blush, when you look at it, to be honest, it's a bit dangerous, meaning the aspect of the melech is not done, that I understand to an extent. What you're doing is you're actually creating an independent judiciary, right? Independent of the king. But in daninoto, the fact that you don't judge the king, I think is a big question mark, a very important question mark, and a little bit potentially disturbing, right? So I want to think about how the two sides of Hamelech lo dan on the one hand and lo daninoto on the other hand sort of pull in different directions, right? The Melech not um, judging creates an independent judiciary, but the Melech not being judged actually may create a problem in that the judiciary can't tame the king, right? So are we talking about something that's lechatchila to create a separation of powers, or are we talking about something that is just capitulating to the problem that you're not going to be able to get the melech to listen to you? So let's keep the czar as far away as we can. And I think that the sources themselves they're kind of going in different directions, right? So the first thing I want to do is I want to note that if we go back to the Tanakhic texts about a king, the legacy of whether a king is done or not is a mixed legacy, actually. And I'm going to share my screen to be able to look at that together. So when you look, for example, at Shmuel Aleph, Eric Chet, where the people are asking for a king, what we have is Vayimrilav, they say to Shmuel, Hine atazakanta, you're old, uvanecha lo achol b'drachecha, and your sons are not following in your footsteps. Ata sima lanu melech l'shoftenu k'chol hagoyim. Make us a king who will judge us like all the nations. It seems like when they ask Shmuel for a king, a fundamental job of the king is to judge them, right? Vayirah hadavar b'nei Shmuel kasher amru tzna lanu melech l'shoftenu vayitbel Shmuel Hashem. And Shmuel's very upset about this. And notice, what is he upset about? He's upset that they asked him, give us a king to judge us, right? So that judgment there of wanting a king to judge seems to go against the concept of the melech is lo dan, right? On the other hand, when you look in Devarim, our initial conversation about a king, it's actually preceded by a discussion of the judicial system, right? If you have a question, a local litigation, and you have a question, where are you going to go? You are going to go get it adjudicated at the Mikdash. And who are you going to go to? Uvata el hakohanim halavim ve'el hashofet asher yeh bayimim haim. You're going to go to the Kohanim and the Levim and to the judge in that time. And they're going to tell you what the rule is. So it's a mixed Tanakhic legacy that on the one hand, Dvarim Yud Zayin, specifically the same parak that talks about a king, doesn't have the king as the judge. It has the Kohanim as judges. And that's very much reflected in the parak that we see, parak bet of Sanhedrin, where we see a Kohen is Dan and Daninoto, but a Melech is not Dan and not Daninoto. So it seems like there is a purposeful separation of powers and a separation of let's get the king out of the judicial system that may be the legacy of Perek Yud Zayin of Devarim, which is what David Flato argues in his wonderful book, The Crown and the Courts, where he really says what's happening in this entire thing of Lo Dan and Lo Daninato is we're really just trying to keep the Melech as far away from the whole legal system as possible, right? We want there to be an independent judiciary, and at the same time, we want there, instead of thinking about the lo daninoto, that we don't judge the king as sort of a capitulation to something that is a negative concept, like we can't tame political power. He actually looks at it as, well, you want the king to be able to be independent, right? So to be able to make the executive branch, as it were, independent, right? So there you have kind of a separation of powers, but you don't necessarily have one balancing another, but it might be the legacy. And it is interesting, to be honest, it wouldn't be the first place where we're trying to separate between the kahuna and the malchut, right? You can probably think of, the three ketarim, the three crowns in Pirkei Avot, right? You have Keter Torah, Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut. And of course, you have Keter Shem Tov, which makes you wonder, are there three crowns, are there four counts? But that's for a different story, right? But also, even biblically, in Divrei Yamim Bet, there's an interesting instance that it isn't about judging, but it is about the Mikdash, and it's about a Melech who seems to want to usurp the duties of the Kohanim. In Divrei Yamim Bet, we see that King Uzziyahu tries to do the avoda in the Beit HaMikdash. It says, "Ukecheskato," Divrei Yamim Bet, Perek Avav, "Ukecheskato gavali bo ad lashchit, vayim'al b'Hashem Elokav." So he becomes very arrogant as he gets stronger. Vayavo elechal Hashem laktir al mizbech ketoret, al mizbech ketoret, and he comes in to the Mikdash thinking he's just going to offer the ketoret, the incense on the altar, which of course is not kosher, bizarre. It can't be done by a non-Kohen. Vayavo acharav Azariyahu HaKohen, v'imo kohanim laHashem shmonim b'nei chayil, and 80 strong priests come after him with Azariah the Kohen, vayamdu al Uzziyahu melech, and they turn to Uzziah, the king, vayarulo lo lecha Uzziyahu lahaktir laHashem. You're not supposed to be doing the ketoret. Ki lekohanim b'nei Aaron hamakudashim lahaktir. We're the ones who are set aside to do this ketoret. Semina mikdash, you got to get out of the mikdash. Kima alta, because you are now trespassing Hashem's mikdash. V'lo lecha lechavod me Hashem Elokim. There's no glory in this, in what you're doing. Vayizaf Uzziyahu, and Uzziyahu gets mad, right? Uviado mikteret lahaktir, and he's holding the incense holder. Uvizapoim hakohanim, and he's so angry. Vatzarat zarcha b'mitzcho lifnei kohanim b'veit Hashem mi'al mizbach haktoret, and he breaks out in tzarat as a punishment. Vayifen elav Azariyahu HaKohen, and this, by the way, is interesting because whose job is it to diagnose tzarat? It is the Kohen's job to diagnose tzarat, and now Uzziyahu has it. Vayifen elav Azariyahu Kohen harosh v'chol hakohanim, and they turn to him, Azariyahu the Kohen, and all of the Kohanim with him. V'nehu b'tzor b'mitzcho, he's got tzarat on his metzach, on his forehead. Vayavhilu misham, they get him out of there. V'gam hu nitchaf latzeit k'nigo Hashem, and he also ran out of there because he's struck with a plague. Right now, remember, he's Tamed as well. He doesn't belong in the Mikdash anymore if he has tzarat. But he was Yahweh Melech Mitzorah Yomoto, and he stayed Mitzorah his whole life. Vayeshev beit hachofshit mitzora ki nigzar beit Hashem v'yotam beno al beit hamelech shofet et am haaretz. Right? So interesting, right? We have he kind of lives as a leper, and his son Yotam is taking over the functions of the king. And notice, by the way, here the function of the king is shofet et am haaretz, is governing the people of the land. But nonetheless, what you do see is a sense that sometimes it's possible that there would be a tacharut, there would be a competition between the power of the king and the power of the Kohanim. And the idea is, sorry, king, don't take the power of the Kohanim. Now, it's interesting, we just finished Hanukkah. So thinking about the fact that the Chashmonaim went in the other direction, right? They were Kohanim, and then they become Melachim. They take the Malchut for themselves instead of giving it to Yehuda, right? So the possible tacharut between the Kohen and the Melech is, quite frankly, might be part of the concern here. So you keep the Kohanim in their lane, and they're going to do mishpat according to our Sanhedrin Perek Bet, and you keep the Malachim in their lane, and they are not going to do mishpat. They're going to do other things, and that's what David Flato essentially says. We see an early separation of powers, and I invite people to read that on their own time. I do have to say, I think that there may be another way of looking at this story, right? That it might not just be about separation of powers. It actually might be that this is a somewhat contested conversation, because maybe it's not such a great idea to have the Melech be completely outside of this whole realm. And so, for example, you have in the Tosefta something that, at least according to some, makes it sound like maybe they can judge Melech Yisrael. Melech Yisrael, it lists all these different things about Melech Yisrael, and one of the things it says, "Ve'over al mitzvat taseh, ve'al mitzvat lo taseh." They can do averot, do shar kol mitzvot. He's treated like a commoner in terms of violating mitzvot. And some people think this means that he actually does get judged. Or moreover, in terms of him actually judging, you have the Mishnah and Sanhedrin, the same Mishnah Zayin, talking about where the king takes the Sefer Torah, says Yoshev Badin, but he imo. He sits with the Sefer Torah when he's Yoshev Badin, which makes it sound like maybe he has his own, maybe he does sit in judgment. And so some people suggest that perhaps the Melech has his own court, meaning there is the judicial court that works in certain ways and by certain accountability structures. And then the Melech also has his own court. Now, what does this mean necessarily about whether he can be taken to the other judicial court? Not totally clear, but it's possible that this separation that seems so stark from the beginning of Perek Bet in the Mishnah is actually a little bit less stark. I also want to add, there's another way of looking at this besides for separation of powers. There's also, and besides for, wait a second, are we sure this is a complete separation? It's also the Yerushalmi and Sanhedrin. It's very interesting. It explains, lo danin אותו, you don't judge the melech. Why? Al shem milfanecha mishpati yetzeh. Because it's based on a pasuk in Tehillim. God is going to judge the king, right? Meaning the idea is not that the king is beyond the law, but that human beings are not the ones to judge, but God is going to judge. So there's almost like a belief in a higher power. Now, I'm not saying that that can't be manipulated for the king never to actually be responsible for anything, but nonetheless, it could be that the idea is the king has to be elevated, and so the king is not part of the judicial court. He has his own courts, and that's Yoshev Badin, with his Sefer Torah. And in terms of being judged, Hashem is going to judge the king. And that's how we sort of like king, senior partner, judicial branch, junior partner, something like that, right? So that's a second way of looking at it, is that it's less about keeping the king away from the judicial branch, and it's more about just making the king special in some way, right? There's a third way to look at this, which I think comes out of our Gemara in Sanhedrin, Yutet, Amud Aleph, Talmud Bet, where we do see the Gemara saying, it's Malchut Yehuda, for Malchei Yehuda, we actually do incorporate them into the judicial system. It's only for Malchei Yisrael that we don't. Why? And they bring this story with Yanai HaMelech, who the rabbis are no big fans of Yanai HaMelech. Also interesting that he is Hasmonean. And Yanai HaMelech is essentially taken to court, and everybody's too afraid, except for Shimon ben Shetach, his brother-in-law. Everyone's too afraid to judge him, and it's a mess. And so what it kind of looks like from the Gemara is not, oh, we really want separation of powers, and this is the way it should be, but actually the way it should be is the Malchut should be involved in judging and being judged, but because Malchei Israel are bad, and they don't listen, they make a mockery of the judicial system. And because they make a mockery of the judicial system, we are capitulating to that fact and saying, okay, we can't judge the king because we can't possibly get him to listen to what we're going to say. And it makes, it turns the judicial system into a farce, right? Now, when I see lo dan velo daninoto, because I worry about the lo daninoto piece, I am less inclined to see this as like a lichatchila, either separation of powers so the judiciary can be independent and the king should be independent, or some sort of, we're trying to give the king some sort of elevated status, but it's okay because Hashem is going to judge the king. I see it much more as capitulation because I'm not sure, and I think we see this even today, I'm not sure that the judicial system can maintain its integrity if it has to try someone with so much power, if that person could intimidate, if that person could make sure that din is not done properly. It really does make a farce out of the judicial system. And one thing that I think is interesting to notice is if you were to isolate the story of Shimon ben Shetach and Yanai, not take the line that comes before it, which is, we're not done Malchei Yisrael, and not take the line after it, which basically says, Ba'otasha Amru, at that moment they said, Melech lo dan v'lo daninoto, lo me'id v'lo me'idinoto. If you actually take out those bookends, the story itself, the story of Yanai basically coming to court and having chutzpah, and then the judges, except for Shimon ben Shetach, feeling unable to judge him, and those judges being punished for not judging him. The story itself, without the framing from the Gemara, like from the, editing of the Gemara, story itself actually cuts in the direction of course you have to judge a Melech Yisrael. These people were punished for not judging a Melech Yisrael. And we actually have to overcome this. We have to override this, almost like the other Tanaitic sources that may indicate that we do actually judge the king. And it's fascinating. There's a Midrash Tanhuma that has the same story. And in the story, the bottom line lesson is not that we don't judge the king. The bottom line lesson is something else. Let's take a look at the Midrash Tanhuma, okay? It says, Ma'aseh be'echad shaya lo din im melech mimalchei beit Chashmonai. So somebody had a litigation with a king from the Hasmonean dynasty. Ba'amad lifnei Shimon ben Shetach, and he came before Shimon ben Shetach. Amarle, and said to him, Din yeshli itzel melech, I have a litigation to bring against the king. Amar Shimon ben Shetach lehem lo tan dayanim shetanimimo. So Shimon ben Shetach turned to the judges that are with him and said, Im mishager ani b'shvil hamelech, atem mochichim oto. If I actually bring the king in for litigation, will you rebuke him? Right? Because he knows I'm not really sure that, these other dayanim are going to be up to the task. Amru lo hein, and they said, yes, we will. Shiger b'shvilo, so he subpoenas him. Ba, he comes, and it's amazing. V'natnu et kiso v'yashav b'tzad Shimon. And he puts either his throne or his seat next to Shimon ben Shetach, the head of the Beit Din. Amar lo Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach says, similar to our Gemara, Amod al raglecha, stand up, v'tein et hadin. Now, tein et hadin literally sounds like it's saying, give the judgment. It's actually a phrase that means accept your punishment. Amar lo, and Shimon ben Shetach says, Danin et hamelech, do we judge the king? Panali mino, and he turns to his right. Now, is it Shimon ben Shetach who turns to his right and is going to see that everyone's squeamish? Or is it Yanai, or whoever this king, Melech Beit Hashmonai, turns to his right and intimidates people, right? Panali mino turns to the right. Kavshu dayanin pneim bakarka, literally ostriches. They bury their head in the sand, like we saw in our Gemara. Lismolo looks to the left. Kavshu pneim bakarka looks down. Ba hamalach v'chavatan bakarka achetz anishmatan. Along comes in our Gemara. We know the name of the malach that did it. Here it's an anonymous malach, just like an anonymous king, who comes and kills them. Miyad nizdazeh hamelech, and look at how this story ends differently. The king gets scared. Miyad amar le Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach turns to the king and says, Amorog lechavetin et adin. Stand up and accept your judgment. Shelo lefanaya tamed. You're not standing before me. Ela lifnei mi shamar v'haya alam. You are standing before God in this courtroom. Shneimar v'amdu shnei anashim asher lehem hariv lifnei Hashem. As the pasuk puts it, standing before God. Now, why does it say standing before God? Because it would be in the Mikdash, right? But standing before God, biyad amad al reglav v'natan et hadin. Immediately he gets up and he accepts his punishment. Now, this version of the story, and there is a whole complicated question about Tanchuma, like does Tanchuma, even though it's edited later than the Bavli, does it preserve earlier material than the Bavli version of the story, or is it a later reworking of the Bavli story? But I do think it's fascinating to see here that what we actually are seeing is you want to be able to be Dan the Melech. You need to be able to stand up to the king. And that's the way that the story ends. And Yana himself, or whoever this Beit Hashmonai king is, says, oh my gosh, this is God, right? This courtroom is not just a secular courtroom. We're not just talking about, it's not separation of powers in a secular kind of sense. This is where you go to be judged by God. And if the king is going to be judged by God, they have to be judged by God by the judges who are appointed. So it's interesting to consider that there's a different version of this story that actually is pushing for a melech to be nidon, to be able to be judged. Else it makes a mockery of the judicial system, because the judicial system is supposed to be representative of God's justice, and a king should be lower than God, not higher than God. Now, what I think is interesting to think about is Yanai, or the Melech Beit Hashmonai here, says, B'chi danin et hamelech. Do you actually judge the king? And I kind of wonder if what we're seeing here is almost a reversal of the Bavli, because the Bavli's version is you judge a melech from Malchut Yehuda, or Beit Yehuda, because they really respect the law. So you can judge them. But you don't judge a melech from Malchei Israel because they're no good. Here, the Midrash Tanchuma, it may be flip, meaning we usually have no reason to judge the melech. If the Melech is from Malchut Yehuda, they're probably very good, and we have no reason to judge them. So Yana is shocked. Why are you judging me? And Shimon Shetach says, why are we judging you? Because you know good. Right? I mean, there's sort of a flip in this story. So rather than seeing a separation of power, what we're looking at here is you must be able to hold the king to account, right? So on that question, the so far, just to remind us, we have three approaches, right? One approach is to say, Melech lo dan v'lo danin oto, we want to keep the king separate from the judicial system so that the judicial system can do its own thing and the king can do his own thing, right? That's separation of powers. It's a good thing. Same way we don't want Uziel going into the Mikdash. Same way we don't want the Hashmonaim being both Kohanim and Melachim. They each have their own place, right? That's one. A second, actually, what we're looking at is a capitulation. And the capitulation is to those who refuse to listen to the judicial system. And if they refuse to listen to the judicial system, we certainly can't judge them because it's going to turn the judicial system into a mess. And we can't let them be judges either, right? This is to preserve, it's a capitulation to something that the ideal would be if they could both be judges in the system, but also be able to be judged by the system. But if they can't be judged by the system, we're not going to let them be judges in the system, right? A third suggestion does not revolve so much around preserving separation of powers as much as this is an honor for the king, right? Hashem is the one who judges the king separately. The king also has his own court. There's something, the royal. And then I would say the fourth approach is, wait a second, the Mishnah says, lo dan, lo danin oto. Not everybody agrees to that. There's a Tosefta that looks like it goes in a different direction. It's a Mishnah Zion looks like it goes in a different direction. The Midrash Tanhuma looks like it might go in a different direction, or maybe there are exceptions to the rules. But what you see here, I think, is what I would say is it's fascinating to see how much ink is spilled over the relationship between the judicial system and the executive political power. I think it speaks to a question about whether the judicial system, whether law really should tame the political power, or whether they really shouldn't touch each other. I want to do one last thing because I think it's so interesting. So there's actually a parallel to this story in Josephus. It's also a third way of telling the story, which is that what happens is there's a young Herod and his father, Antipater, and they are not kings. Hyrcanus is the king. And Herod, he kills some people. He sort of kills some people who, in theory, the king probably would have wanted to kill for the bad things that they did. But Herod asserts his own dominance and does it himself, kind of looking like he's trying to usurp a sense of power, right? So the way that Josephus, he tells the story in a few different places, but the way that Josephus tells the story in Jewish antiquities says the chief Jews were in great fear when they saw how powerful and reckless Herod was and how much he desired to be a dictator. These Jews came to Hyrcanus and asked in disbelief, do you not see that Antipater and his sons have girded themselves with royal power while you only have the name of king given you, right? Because remember, he's sort of, Hyrcanus is somewhat of they're looking at him as a puppet. But do not let these things go unnoticed, nor consider yourself free of danger, because you are careless of yourself and the kingdom. For no longer are Antipater and his sons merely your stewards in the government, and do not deceive yourselves with the belief that they are. They are openly acknowledged to be masters. They are trying to usurp power. Thus, Herod, his son, Antipater's son, has killed Ezekias and many of his men in violation of our law, which forbids us to slay a man, even an evildoer, unless he's first been condemned by the Sanhedrin to suffer this fate. He, however, has dared to do this without any authority from you, right? So what happens is Herod then gets subpoenaed to be judged. And it's interesting, be judged by whom? So Josephus, in a different one of his books, tells, well, if Herod is not a king, but still a commoner, he ought to appear in court and answer for his conduct to the king and to his country's laws, which do not permit anyone to be put to death without trial. So first of all, it assumes here that if you're a king, you don't get judged. But in order to show that Herod is a commoner, he's going to have to come in front of the Sanhedrin. So when Herod comes in front of the Sanhedrin, when Herod stood in the Sanhedrin with his troops, he overawed them all. And no one of those who had denounced him before his arrival dared to accuse him thereafter. Instead, there was silence and doubt about what was to be done. When the affairs stood thus, one whose name was Sameas, very close to the name Shimon, a righteous man he was, and for that reason, above all fear, rose up and said, fellow counselors and king, I do not myself know of, nor do I suppose that you can name anyone who, when summoned before you for trial, has ever presented such an appearance. For no matter who it was that came before the Sanhedrin for trial, he has shown himself humble and has assumed the manner of one who is fearful and seeks mercy from you by letting his hair grow long, wearing a black garment, and mournful behavior. But this fine fellow Herod, who is accused of murder and has been summoned on no less grave a charge than this, stands here clothed in purple, with the hair on his head carefully arranged, and with his soldiers round him, in order to kill us if we condemn him as the law prescribed, and to save himself by outraging justice. And he says, I don't make this complaint against Herod. He is, to be sure, more concerned for himself than for the laws. But my complaint is against you, the court, and your king, who gave him license to do so. However, take you notice that God is great, and that this very man whom you're going to absolve and dismiss for the sake of Hyrcanus will one day punish both you and your king himself also. Nor did Sameas make any mistake on part of this prediction, for when Herod had received the kingdom, Herod eventually does become king. He slew all the members of the Sanhedrin and Hyrcanus, the previous king himself also, except he doesn't kill Sameas, for he had great honor for him on account of his righteousness, and because when the city was afterward besieged by Herod and Sosius, he persuaded the people to admit Herod into it, right? And told them that for their sins, they would not be able to escape his hands, which things will be related by us in their proper places. So for whatever reason, he let Sameas live. But this is a great version of the story. First of all, Josephus is writing in the first century, Common Era, which is before the Gemara, it's before the Tanchuma. But I want us to notice it does seem to suggest that the king would not be judged, right? If he's a commoner and not a king, he should be judged. That's why Herod can be judged. And it also seems to be that the Sanhedrin in some way is working with or for Hyrcanus, right? That Hyrcanus is not totally independent or separate. And the issue here seems to be that even a commoner seems to be able to manipulate and intimidate the Sanhedrin, which is a problem. And Hyrcanus is basically being told by this Sameas, Hyrcanus, have some backbone. Sanhedrin, have some backbone. You need to be ensuring that some political rival doesn't just come up the ranks and do things that are totally violent and wrong, right? Such as killing people without the agreement of the Sanhedrin. And so here, when you look at how the court is used, the court is actually used to prevent violence that's not state sanctioned, right? Herod committed violence that's not state sanctioned. And I'm less worried about, is the king allowed to be part of the Sanhedrin? Because it seems like King Hyrcanus is playing some sort of role. And I'm more concerned about the role of Sanhedrin and the king at keeping order, right? So I'm not worried about the king not listening to the Sanhedrin. I'm worried about the king and the Sanhedrin not being tough enough, right? So all of this is basically to say that the function of the Sanhedrin, the function of the judicial branch, is supposed to be to keep power in check? And the question is, do they see their do they see their work as keeping the power of the king in check? Even do they see their work as keeping the power of the constituencies in check? Mostly, do they expect the king to be above the law because the king is that good? Or do they expect the king to be above the law because the king, there's nothing they can do? They're kind of stuck. And I don't think it's such a far cry to say that some of these same questions arise today, which is, who is it that the judicial system is actually able to curb? And where are there politics or fear of reprisals that seep in and challenge the integrity of judicial systems? So we'll just put that in our brains and think about it. Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to continuing to learn next week.